Today, we're going to get into something I think is pretty fascinating, the book talk to Hollywood problem. We're going to break down this really sharp critique of the film Reminders of Him to figure out what happens, what can go wrong, when viral hype starts calling the shots in Hollywood.
So, let's start with a big question. What really happens when a book talk sensation is chosen to be Hollywood's next blockbuster? Well, the source we're diving into today argues that the results can be, let's just say, really complicated. It's a question that's not just about TikTok's influence, but about the very craft of storytelling itself.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll get into the main argument about the whole book talk to Hollywood pipeline. Then, we'll use Reminders of Him as our case study, digging into the characters, the dialogue, and the wild pacing. And finally, we'll get to the source's pretty damning final verdict. Okay, so the source starts by calling author Colleen Hoover the, quote, unofficial leader of BookTok. And it points out that, yeah, she has this massive dedicated fan base, but she's also at the center of a pretty fierce debate. The big question is, do her stories actually romanticize toxic relationships? And this is really the heart of the issue. You can see this huge divide here. What her fans see as these messy, dramatic, emotional love stories, critics are pointing to and saying, hang on, this looks a lot like romanticizing manipulation, or even using something as serious as abuse as a plot twist. This clash of perspectives is absolutely key to understanding the critique of the movie. So how does all this theory actually look on the big screen? Well, the source points its finger directly at the film adaptation of Reminders of Him. The reviewer basically says it has all the same problems they see in the books, but this time with, and I'm quoting, less chemistry and more confusion. And listen, the premise alone is an absolute minefield. You have a woman who gets out of prison for a DUI that killed her boyfriend, and then she falls in love with his best friend. So right away, you know this is not going to be your typical rom-com. Now, according to the source, the single biggest issue with this film is that the characters, they just don't feel like real human beings. The way they talk, the way they interact, it all feels so artificial that it's basically impossible to connect with the story on any real emotional level.
Okay, get this. The source pulls this specific line as a perfect example of what it calls unhinged dialogue. The main character, Kenna, says this in a dark, divey-looking bar. Not a coffee shop, a bar. It's one of those moments that just completely pulls you out of the movie.
And here's why that ridiculous coffee order is so important. It's not just a quirky character choice, it's a lazy plot device. The only reason she says it is so the bartender can remember it and make it for her later in what's supposed to be this big romantic gesture. But it feels totally unearned because it's built on something that just wouldn't happen.
And oh, it doesn't stop there. Take this line.
The review calls it out for, quote, trying way too hard to sound deep. You know, it's just such a sweeping, absolute statement that it doesn't feel like genuine sadness. It feels like a writer trying to force-feed you melodrama. It's not just what these characters say, it's what they do. The source lists these actions that just defy all logic. I mean, who steals a roadside memorial cross? And the male lead never, not once, bothered to look up a photo of the woman who killed his best friend. These things only happen to create drama, and it just shatters any sense of realism. So, you've got these unbelievable characters, and they're dropped into an equally unbelievable plot. The source argues the film's pacing gives you emotional whiplash, where these huge, life-altering conflicts get introduced, and then, poof, they're resolved in like a minute. I mean, just look at this timeline. A giant dramatic reveal of who she is gets resolved just a few minutes later. He finds the stolen memorial cross under her sink, which should be a massive betrayal, and literally 2 seconds later, they're making out. This is exactly what the source means when it says the movie feels unnecessarily long and so fast-paced all at the same time. So what's the big deal if everything's resolved so quickly? Well, the cost is enormous. When you solve every conflict in 30 seconds, you completely sidestep the story's own powerful themes. How can you possibly explore complex ideas like grief or forgiveness when the story just sprints past every single moment that matters? All right, so where does that leave us? What's the final verdict here? According to the source, this movie isn't just a bad romance. It's a complete failure to handle its own heavy, complicated subject matter with any of the care it actually deserves. And, you know, beyond the bizarre pacing, the source argues that the central relationship is actually really troubling. Think about it. Kenna is fresh out of prison, Ledger is her boss, he's her only link to her daughter, and he's one of the only people in town not treating her like a monster. This creates a huge power imbalance where she is completely dependent on him, and the movie frames this as romantic.
And then there's this moment that the source flags as just baffling. The morning after she sleeps with Ledger, Kenna writes this line in a letter to Scotty, her dead boyfriend. The line is just thrown out there. And Ledger laughs. The source is left wondering, what on earth is this scene trying to do? It calls the whole thing weirdly cruel.
So let's just pull this all together. The core criticisms are, 1, it tries to position a drunk driver as a sympathetic hero. 2, it completely trivializes massive themes like grief and accountability. And 3, it wraps all of this trauma up into a strange, romanticized story. The end result, according to the reviewer, isn't just bad filmmaking, it's genuinely tired.
And really, this brings us all the way back to the beginning. The source's final plea isn't just about trashing one movie. It's about the whole BookTok to Hollywood pipeline. It's an appeal to creators to look beyond the viral hype and start adapting genuinely good stories that have the depth and realism that cinema can offer. And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. Where do we draw the line between a story that's messy and complicated and one that is actively romanticizing harmful dynamics? Can a story that's built on such profound grief and guilt ever really work as a romance? It's a tough question, and it gets right to the heart of what we want from the stories we love.